In today's episode of The Message That Got Mythed, we are going to be taking a look at the iconic graphic novel Watchmen. Being the only graphic novel to ever win a Hugo Award, I am going to bring forth the case that this story does not revolve around the fan favorites such as the Comedian, Dr. Manhattan, or Rorschach, although they do play key parts, but in all actuality, it revolves around one of the lesser predominant characters. Through Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' masterpiece, they breathe life into the archetypal pattern that centers around everyone's favorite line.
None of you seem to understand. I'm not locked in here with you.
That's it! You're locked in here with me!
This dark graphic novel is basically modern-day mythology, exemplifying the story of the Chainbreaker. Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons have been said to incorporate different themes of inspiration and certain traits of uniqueness into Watchmen. Other symbolism and imagery have happened to appear in the comic as if by magic, according to Moore. But considering that Moore is an occultist, that statement could be taken with a grain of salt. I am your host, Jacqueline Nicole, and although many other people have looked at this monumental graphic novel, in this series, titled Watching the Watchmen, I am going to explain the themes and patterns that I personally see in this great story. It's common knowledge that certain genes get passed down from our ancestors. Most people have been told by a friend of the family that they resemble an elder. But there's something else that can be passed down without it being so obvious, and that is generational trauma. These trauma cycles typically show up in lineages as addictions, certain mentalities, approaches to life, or other habits or modes of operating. Watchmen hides not only this manifestation of generational trauma, but also how to break out of this loop. A lot of people will be familiar with the pattern of a child marrying an embodiment of their parent. You know, the chick who's dating someone that's just like their father. Oh wait, that's Lori. In Watchmen, one of the subplots is Lori breaking her family's trauma cycle. At first, she is seen repeating the patterns of Sally until she cuts her own Gordian knot. In the beginning, she is much like her mother, and quite frankly, she seems more forced into it. But this is also the thing with generational trauma. People will be shunned from stepping outside the habits of the family, whether it be good or bad, and will generally be shielded from the truth. The contrasts between Lori and Sally are massively evident in everything from their approach to dealing with hardships, being able to let go of the past, and maturing in general. These patterns appear somewhat subtly at first, but it's like the FedEx arrow. Once it's pointed out to you, you can't ignore it. We all know Sally has been, and still is, in love with the Comedian. And to be quite frank, the Comedian has always been, and still is, in love with Sally. Up until his death, that is. Although the two of them could never fully realize their affections for each other and tended to avoid each other, instead opting to keep their nostalgic memories close and constant. The Comedian especially seems unable to keep any sort of intimate or close relationship. According to psychologists John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, this aversion to close relationships demonstrates an avoidant attachment style. Attachment styles are how we develop bonds with other people. Characteristics of an avoidant attachment style are having an inflated sense of self and appearing well put together, relying on themselves for soothing and comfort, difficulties displaying intimacy and vulnerability, dismissing the needs of other people, favoring a joint experience to get in touch with their own emotions, using other people's flaws to push them away, and generally incapable of conflict repair. All these traits fall under avoidant characteristics, although you don't need all of them to be considered one, but I'd say 3's a pattern. Eddie Blake shows many of these traits throughout the story. He visits Moloch's when he's at wit's end and implies a long-time camaraderie. He's definitely got an inflated sense of self, acts like no one else matters, and vulnerability isn't really his thing. In general, Eddie is quite detached, and he knows it. Dr. Manhattan expresses much of the same traits. He dismisses Laurie when she feels the need to invest in the relationship and go to dinner. It's also noted that he's happy at Rockefeller Center because he can do his work, whereas Laurie feels that they won't have any privacy. And he's also guilty on focusing on flaws, stating that Janie is getting older, which apparently is a no-no when you're human. John can't even get fully in touch with pleasing either of his women in the bedroom. Then there's the shared experience of Laurie figuring out that the comedian was her father. It's safe to say that both John Osterman and Eddie Blake are avoidants. Dan, on the other hand, is capable of close relationships. He knows how to maintain a friendship with the first night owl. He doesn't focus on the flaws of his friend Rorschach, who is noted of having poor hygiene and is a bit rigid in his ways, should we say. Dan is also capable of conflict repair, and he can express his vulnerabilities to people who are getting closer to him. Night Owl has a positive view of himself and, for the most part, the people around him. These qualities are all characteristics of what is known as secure attachment. Another notable difference in these three guys, and how Laurie eventually deviates from her mother's patterns, is that Dr. Manhattan and the comedian are more along the lines of protectors. Alan Moore hints at this symbolism through their jobs as being protectors of the nation. There's nothing wrong with being a protector, it's just that Dr. Manhattan and the comedian favor this so heavily that they provide barely anything for their partners. Dan provides more than that. Yes, he inherited some money, but he also provides other resources such as companionship, joint adventures, and a safe space for Laurie. Dan's not a superior protector, but he does try. Sometimes Dan's failing can be a good thing, as it allows Laurie to grow in her own capabilities, which in turn encourages Dan to get back on the horse and become better himself. Both people in this relationship foster each other's growth. You know, the thing that's contrary to the helplessness or victim mindset of generational trauma. When people are always protected and shielded from things, they tend to lose the chance to grow, to let go, and to mature as a person. Eddie, Sally, and Dr. Manhattan are all fairly nostalgic. They cling on to their superhero personas as they age and can't seem to move on and put the past behind them. Laurie has no problem doing this. She has the courage to face the uncertain future if she retires from being a vigilante, but she also recognizes that those years were a part of her life. Dan shares this ability to hang up his costume as well. Although by the end of the story we do see Dr. Manhattan start to move on, but Eddie and Sally are doomed to be trapped in their best years, should we call it. I also like to think that Gibbons and Moore hint at this generational pattern repetition, with both Eddie and John being trapped in their death. Anyways, Sally always identifies herself as a sex object from her golden years.
I was a hero, goddammit!
Yet throughout the story, we see Laurie deviating from
I have a real name I've been using a couple years now. Try it.
It's like Eddie and Sally can't face the reality of growing up. Oh wait, they can't. Sally drinks endlessly as a way of escapism, and Eddie hunkers down in his daydreaming as a way of escaping the truth. Good old nostalgia. So addicting. Laurie isn't exactly the best at this at the beginning, but she eventually accepts that the comedian was her father and acknowledges that her mom has her own demons. And that's okay. We all do. The last bit of the story is Laurie facing reality, and through it giving her mom forgiveness and integrating some parts of her father, which she now has accepted. Laurie being able to face facts, or reality as some might put it, makes her better equipped to grow as a person and be in charge of her own life. This ability to face harsh truths and accept that people do things differently than us is part of conflict repair and intimacy. Sally and Eddie couldn't resolve a disagreement if their life depended on it, mainly because they can't acknowledge their own feelings, whether it be feelings for each other or any other deeper situation in life. Eddie and Sally tend to walk away from this situation rather than repair it. Laurie, on the other hand, talks with John. They end up fighting, but they are at least trying to resolve some differences. This is a step towards being more connected with people. as conflict repair is the ability to have faith in a difficult situation and trust that you'll get through it together. In Watchmen, there are two different notable moments where conflict comes up involving Laurie. First, she has an awkward moment with Dan, and then comes up to try and repair the damage through what's been modeled to her so far in life: sex. She offers herself to Dan. Secondly, we know that the situation isn't Dan's best moment. Some people might say that during this scene he can't get it up, but I'd be willing to bet that he's more aroused by connection than superficial offering. Dan seems to understand people to be more than one-dimensional, and he also connects on more than a physical level. We could look at his lack of performance as a type of conflict, or at the very least, a moment when communication is needed. But he remains in the dynamic him and Laurie have, and doesn't throw it all away due to one rough moment. Laurie and Dan choosing to remain in a joint dynamic, giving things time to evolve, and working through conflict together is another way we see Laurie break out of her family patterns. The evolution of a person takes time and space, which creates bonding. Dan provides this time and space to Laurie. Unlike her mother, Laurie doesn't reside in a mental limbo of options, and she makes decisions. She decides to leave John and sticks to it. Laurie chooses to stay at a hotel, and she chooses to stay separated from Dr. Manhattan. Dan is a supportive friend during these matters, allowing her to make her own choices. Once again, this is a contrast from the comedian and Dr. Manhattan. When John Osterman is human, he never chooses anything for himself. We only see Dr. Manhattan start to make personal choices well after he obtains his superpowers. The only kind of decisions Eddie can make are purely selfish ones, but even those decisions aren't really to himself. It seems more like they're decisions to his image or persona. Being the protectors these two are, they tend to have the government deciding the direction of their lives. When it comes down to it, the comedian can't take a good hard look at himself, or maybe even ends up understanding himself too late. And Sally can't make the decision to move on or try to patch things up with Eddie, since it's him she's always been in love with. Laurie has no problem identifying her options and feelings, executing her decisions, and sticking to what she says she's going to do, thus breaking some unhealthy generational patterns. In conclusion, the journey that we see of Laurie maturing and breaking the chains of her family's toxic cycles is a deep one. She acknowledges the traits she has from her mom and her dad, but at the same time, she is willing to morph these patterns into her own choosing. She gradually chooses to stop avoiding the things she's afraid of, let go of past events, and face her own problems. This freedom of choice is the opposite of being trapped in your own life, your own patterns, and your own doom. She does not subscribe to the victim mentality. She takes control of her decisions, and she rises above it. Psychologically, Laurie, or anyone, choosing to break from these generational patterns is best summed up in one way.
None of you seem to understand. I'm not locked in here with you.
That's it! You're locked in here with me!
Through this episode of Watching the Watchmen, we can now see that one of the messages that got mythed is that of the Chainbreaker. Thank you for watching.